Stand on any street corner in London today, and you'll hear a dozen languages in as many minutes. Nearly 40% of Londoners were born outside the UK, making this one of the most diverse cities on Earth. But rewind 2,000 years, and you'd find marshland along a tidal river, barely inhabited, strategically useless to anyone except the Romans. Invasion, fire, plague, revolution. A small trading post that became the heart of an empire, a city burned to ash and rebuilt from stone. Through conquest and catastrophe, London kept growing, kept adapting, kept pulling people in from everywhere. For centuries, we've had to imagine what those earlier versions of London actually looked like. Artist sketches, faded engravings, descriptions in old journals. But now, using AI trained on historical imagery, we can take those original drawings and paintings and see them as they might have appeared in real life. The cobblestones, the crowns, the smoke rising from medieval chimneys. You're about to witness almost 2,000 years of history in one video. Sit back and relax as we journey through the incredible history of the capital of the United Kingdom, London Roman era. Let's go back to where it all began. The year is 43 AD. 4 Roman legions have just landed on the Kent coast, and they're pushing inland. They need a place to cross the Thames, somewhere they can build a bridge and establish supply lines back to the continent. They find it here at the river's lowest crossing point before it widens into an estuary. Within a decade, Londinium is bustling. Merchants from Gaul, soldiers from Syria, traders from North Africa. The Romans build their bridge exactly where London Bridge stands today. Around it, a port town springs up almost overnight. But 17 years after its founding, disaster strikes. Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe has had enough of Roman occupation. Her army marches on Londinium and burns it to the ground. Archaeological digs have found a layer of red ash beneath the modern city, evidence of that destruction. The Romans rebuild bigger than before. They construct a massive wall around the city, parts of which still stand 2,000 years later. At its peak, Londinium is home to maybe 60,000 people, the largest city in Britannia. Amphitheaters, bathhouses, forums. This isn't some frontier outpost anymore. It's a proper Roman city. Then by around 410 AD, Rome itself is crumbling. Barbarian tribes are hammering the empire from all sides, and Britain is too far away, too expensive to defend. Emperor Honorius sends word, "You're on your own." The legions pull out. Without Rome, Londinium's entire economy collapses. The trade networks that brought wine from Gaul and olive oil from Spain simply stop. Roman currency becomes worthless. The merchants leave, the officials leave, the skilled craftsmen leave. Within a generation, a city of perhaps 50,000 people dwindles to a few hundred squatters living in the ruins. For the next 2 centuries, the grand buildings slowly fall apart. Roofs cave in, walls crumble, weeds push through mosaic floors. But the Thames keeps flowing, and rivers have a way of attracting new people with new ideas about what a city should be. The Saxons who settle in Britain after the Romans leave don't particularly like cities. They're farmers, village people. They actually avoid the old Roman city, seeing it as haunted, cursed. One Saxon poet calls the ruins the work of giants. They can't imagine how mere humans could have built such massive structures. Instead, around the 600 CE, they build a new settlement about a mile west of the Roman walls. They call it London Wick, London Trading Town. This is where modern Covent Garden and the Strand are today. If you're watching a performance at the Royal Opera House, you're sitting directly above Saxon London. By the early 700s, goods are flowing in from all over. Amber from the Baltic, millstones and wine jars from the Rhineland, pottery and metalwork from France and Germany. At its peak, Londonwick might have 8,000 people living there, not huge by Roman standards, but thriving. Then the Vikings arrive, Starting in the late 8th century, Norse raiders keep hitting the settlement. These aren't just raids anymore. They're coming up the Thames in force. In 842, they sack Londonwick completely. In 851, they do it again. King Alfred the Great finally has enough. In 886, he retakes London from the Danes and does something clever. He abandons Londonwick and moves everyone back inside the old Roman walled city, which is much easier to defend. He repairs the ancient walls, recuts the defensive ditches. The city is now called Londonburh, London Fortress. Londonwick is left empty, gradually earning a new name, Ealdwick, the old settlement. That name survives today as Aldwych, the curved street in central London. Over the next century and a half, the city changes hands multiple times between Saxon and Danish rulers. In 1016, King Canute, yes, the one from the legend about commanding the tide, makes London his capital. When Edward the Confessor becomes king in 1042, he builds Westminster Abbey, just west of the city. That decision will shape London's geography forever, the city for commerce, Westminster for power. Edward the Confessor dies childless in January 1066, and England tears itself apart over who should rule next. Harold Godwinson is crowned king, but across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, claims Edward promised him the throne. In September, Harold has to march north to fight off a Norwegian invasion. He wins, but has barely caught his breath when news arrives. William has landed on the south coast with 7,000 Norman soldiers. Harold rushes his exhausted army south and meets William at Hastings on the 14th of October. By nightfall, Harold is dead, and William has won England. On Christmas Day 1066, Hes crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The Anglo-Saxon era is over. The Normans have arrived, and they're going to rebuild England in their own image, starting with London. William doesn't entirely trust London's population. They supported Harold after all, so he builds not one, but 3 fortresses to keep them in line. The biggest becomes the Tower of London, which starts as a symbol of oppression and will remain a symbol of royal power for the next 1,000 years. The White Tower, its central keep, is a statement in stone, 90 feet high, walls 12 feet thick in places. It dominates the skyline, a constant reminder of who's in charge now. Medieval London is cramped, chaotic, and increasingly wealthy. By 1100, maybe 15,000 people live here. The city's merchants form guilds that control trades: goldsmiths, fishmongers, drapers, mercers. These guilds become so powerful that the king has to negotiate with them. In 1215, when the barons force King John to sign the Magna Carta, London's support is crucial. The city extracts its own concessions: the right to elect its own mayor, freedom from arbitrary taxes. London Bridge, rebuilt in stone between 1176 and 1209, becomes a city unto itself. It takes 33 years to build. Shops and houses line both sides. The bridge has a chapel, a drawbridge, even heads of traitors displayed on spikes as a warning. For over 600 years, it's the only bridge across the Thames in London. Then, in 1348, ships arrive at London's docks carrying rats. And on those rats, fleas, and in those fleas, Yersinia pestis. The Black Death. Within 2 years, somewhere between 1/3 and half of London's population is dead. The city that has grown to maybe 80,000 people is suddenly half empty. Entire streets are abandoned. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. Mass graves are dug in fields outside the city walls. The city recovers slowly. By the late 14th century, London is growing again, but tensions are rising too. In 1381, peasants and workers march on London, demanding an end to serfdom and unfair taxes. Wat Tyler leads them. They storm the Tower, execute the Archbishop of Canterbury, burn the palace of John of Gaunt. The teenage King Richard II meets with them, makes promises. The peasants' revolt is ultimately crushed. Tyler is killed, the leaders hunted down and executed. But it terrifies the ruling class. The common people of London have discovered their power, and they won't forget it. By 1500, London's population has rebounded to about 50,000. Then something remarkable happens. It explodes. By 1600, it's 200,000. By 1650, it's nearly 400,000. London becomes the largest city in Europe. Henry VI's break with Rome in the 1530s transforms the city's landscape. Henry wanted to divorce his first wife, but the Pope refused. So Henry broke away from the Catholic Church, made himself head of the new Church of England, and shut down all the monasteries in London. Monasteries owned massive amounts of land. Once Henry seized it, that property became available. Aristocrats and wealthy merchants bought it up and built grand houses. Suddenly, London had room to expand. Under Queen Elizabeth, London becomes the cultural capital of Europe. The Globe Theatre opens on the South Bank in 1599. Shakespeare is staging Hamlet, Othello, King Lear. Meanwhile, merchants are getting wealthy from trade with the New World and Asia. The East India Company is founded in 1600. Setting the stage for empire. But London has always been vulnerable to disease and fire. The city is built almost entirely of timber with thatched roofs, dried straw and reeds. Houses are packed close together, upper floors overhanging narrow streets, nearly touching across the gaps. Open fires in every building for cooking and heating. Candles everywhere, no fire departments. It's a tinderbox. Both disaster and disease strike in the 1060s with devastating effect. In 1665, the plague returns. Not the Black Death exactly, but close enough. At its peak, 7,000 Londoners are dying every week. The wealthy flee to the countryside. The poor are trapped. By the time it burns out, maybe 100,000 people are dead, a quarter of the city's population. The following year, on the 2nd of September, 1666, a fire starts in a bakery on Pudding Lane. It's been a hot, dry summer. Strong winds are blowing. The fire spreads faster than anyone thought possible. For 4 days, London burns. 85% of the city within the walls is destroyed. 13,000 houses gone. 87 churches, including the old St. Paul's Cathedral. Remarkably, only about 6 people die in the fire itself, but 100,000 are left homeless. Christopher Wren sees an opportunity. He proposes a completely new city plan: wide boulevards, classical architecture, open squares. It's an enlightened vision, and it's almost completely rejected. Property rights are too complicated, rebuilding too urgent. Most streets follow their medieval patterns. But the city is rebuilt differently. New building regulations require brick and stone instead of timber and thatch, far more resistant to fire. And Wren does get to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral. The new one with the iconic dome takes 35 years to complete. It's still there, dominating the skyline centuries later, one of the few buildings to survive the Blitz. 18th century London is the center of the Enlightenment. Coffee houses become the internet of their day, places where ideas and news spread rapidly. Lloyd's Coffee House becomes Lloyd's of London, the insurance market. Jonathan's Coffee House becomes the London Stock Exchange. London is also becoming the capital of an empire. In 1735, Robert Walpole becomes the first Prime Minister to live at 10 Downing Street, which will remain the official residence for centuries. George III buys Buckingham House in 1761 as a private residence for his family. It will eventually become Buckingham Palace. The city is expanding physically too. Westminster Bridge opens in 1750, finally giving London a second crossing after 6 centuries with only London Bridge. Blackfriars Bridge follows in 1769. After the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, Britain was the dominant world power. And London is where the money is. Banks, trading houses, shipping companies. Wealth is pouring in from India, the Caribbean, Africa. Then comes the Industrial Revolution. and London transforms yet again. Factories, railways, mass production. In 1801, London has just over 1 million people. By 1851, it's 2.5 million. By 1901, 6.5 million. It's the largest city in the world. The Victorians built on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Trafalgar Square is laid out in the 1840s, commemorating Nelson's victory. The Houses of Parliament and Big Ben rise in the 1850s after the old palace burns down, that iconic Gothic revival architecture defining the city's identity. In 1851, the Great Exhibition opens in Hyde Park. The Crystal Palace, a massive structure of iron and glass, showcases Britain's industrial dominance to the world. 6 million people visit. It's a moment of supreme confidence. Britain at the peak of its power. The sewage system still in use today, built by Joseph Bazalgette, after the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so polluted Parliament had to shut down. Bazalgette's sewers finally fixed the problem, channeling waste away from the river. The Underground, the world's first subway system, opening in 1863. The Tower Bridge, an engineering marvel, completed in 1894. But Victorian London is also a city of brutal inequality. The rich live in Mayfair and Belgravia in extraordinary comfort. Poor are crammed into East End slums. Cholera outbreaks kill tens of thousands in the 1830s and 1840s. Entire neighborhoods wiped out by contaminated water. It takes a doctor named John Snow proving in 1854 that cholera spreads through water, not air, before anyone fixes the problem. In 1829, Robert Peel establishes the Metropolitan Police, the first professional police force, nicknamed Bobbies after him. But the city's dark side persists. In 1888, Jack the Ripper terrorizes Whitechapel, murdering at least 5 women. Hes never caught. The case becomes infamous, a symbol of Victorian London's dangerous underbelly. Charles Dickens writes about it all: the workhouses, slums, the children working in factories. The contrast between the world's wealthiest empire and its desperate poor, all compressed into the same city. The 20th century brings London back down to earth. The First World War kills hundreds of thousands of young British men. However, London's main infrastructure survived. But the Second World War brings the war directly to the city. The Blitz. Between September 1940 and May 1941, German bombers hit London almost every night. Entire neighborhoods are leveled. St. Paul's Cathedral miraculously survives, photographs showing it standing defiant amid the smoke and flames. By the end of the war, 1 million buildings are damaged or destroyed, and almost 500,000 souls from the UK are lost. Post-war London is broke, bombed out, exhausted. The empire is collapsing. India gains independence in 1947. Rationing continues into the 1950s. Fog and coal smoke are so thick that in 1952 the Great Smog kills 12,000 people in just 5 days. But London rebuilds again. The 1951 Festival of Britain held on the South Bank signals a new beginning. Brutalist towers rise from the rubble, the welfare state expands, and crucially, people start arriving from former colonies. The Windrush generation from the Caribbean in 1948, followed by waves of immigration from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, later from Africa, Eastern Europe, everywhere. The 1960s bring a cultural explosion, swinging London. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Carnaby Street, Mary Quant. For a moment, London feels young again. The next few decades are rockier. Economic decline strikes, terrorism from the IRA. By the 1980s, the Docklands are abandoned. The East End is neglected. Then comes massive redevelopment. Canary Wharf rises from the old docks. The financial sector booms. London reinvents itself as a global financial centre. The 21st century began with the Millennium Dome, a colossal, costly failure that eventually evolved into the O2 Arena. Yet, London continued to grow. The 2012 Olympic Games completely transformed East London, bringing with them massive investment and infrastructure improvements. The city's population surpassed 9 million, reaching its highest level since before World War II. Modern London is defined by its diversity. Over 300 languages are spoken here. Entire communities have roots in different corners of the world. Caribbean culture in Brixton, South Asian communities in Southall, Chinatown, Turkish enclaves in Dalston, Polish neighborhoods in Hammersmith. You can eat food from any country, hear music from any tradition, and find communities from absolutely anywhere. The skyline is constantly changing too. The Shard, the Gherkin, the walkie-talkie. Traditional classical architecture stands shoulder to shoulder with glass and steel towers. It is controversial. People argue about it endlessly, but it is happening. London survived the Roman retreat, Viking raids, the Black Death, the Great Fire, and the Blitz. Every time it rebuilt, every time it adapted, every time it drew in fresh blood with new ideas. That is what makes London, London. It is messy, crowded, expensive, and incredibly complex, and it has been for the past 2,000 years. Thank you for watching. Making videos like this takes a massive amount of research and time, and for me, it is mostly a labor of love, trying to piece together several thousand years of history into one coherent story. If you enjoyed this journey witnessing the evolution of London, from Roman marshland to global metropolis, I would greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe for more in-depth historical content. Let me know in the comments which city's story you would like to see next. As always, see you in the past.